As our plane landed in California, a mix of excitement and fatigue from the long flight washed over me. Thomas immediately began checking our luggage, making sure nothing was lost. He was always like this, attentive to every detail, completely absorbed in organizational matters. On one hand, it brought me comfort, knowing everything would be taken care of. But on the other hand, it left me feeling somewhat invisible, as if I were just another item on his checklist. When we arrived at Luis's apartment, the warm coastal air enveloped me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the sea. Luis, my nephew, greeted us with a bright smile, full of the kind of carefree energy that always drew people to him. This was one of the stops we had planned for our trip, and his enthusiasm stood in sharp contrast to Thomas's usual businesslike approach. "Aunt Anna, Uncle Thomas, I'm so happy to see you," Luis exclaimed, hugging me tightly, as if we hadn't seen each other in years. Thomas, meanwhile, was already scanning the apartment, making sure everything was comfortable and aligned with our plans. I noticed this with a slight sense of disappointment. His focus was always more on logistics than on how we actually felt. Maybe that's where the problem lay. I didn't dwell on it much at the time, but the seed of doubt had already been planted somewhere deep inside me. Luis, on the other hand, was full of life, his carefree spirit a stark contrast to Thomas's seriousness. There was something in his gaze that made me feel seen again, as though I mattered, but I quickly pushed those thoughts away. It was just the fatigue and excitement of the journey. We still had so many adventures ahead, and, as always, Thomas had planned everything perfectly. The next morning, we decided to take a walk along the seafront. The air was fresh, the sun gently touching my skin, and the warm sea breeze played with our hair. Thomas, as usual, was full of plans and ideas. We walked, discussing the places we still wanted to visit, sharing thoughts about upcoming excursions. Thomas was excited about visiting an old lighthouse nearby and how great it would be to catch the sunset. I walked beside Thomas, listening to him, but my thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. Luis was walking behind us, occasionally chiming in with Thomas, but I could feel his presence, the light, carefree energy he carried, his youth, and his joy for life. I found myself increasingly drawn to these little things, and I liked it. We turned onto a path along the coast. Suddenly the wind picked up, stirring the waves and sending cool gusts our way. My light short dress suddenly flew up, catching me off guard. The hem lifted, revealing more than I had intended, and I quickly spun around to smooth it down. But before I could, I caught Luis's gaze. He was standing behind me, his eyes locked on my figure, frozen in a moment of undeniable admiration. "Luis, what are you looking at?" I called out, trying to sound stern, but inside everything flipped upside down. He blushed, quickly looking away, mumbling something about the wind and how it was an accident. But I had already seen everything I needed to. I should have felt annoyed or embarrassed, but instead I found myself strangely excited by the moment. It was wrong, but his gaze, full of admiration, stirred something in me. I felt a new, unfamiliar sensation awakening inside, something I couldn't ignore. We continued the walk, but the atmosphere between me and Luis had shifted. Thomas was still talking about the lighthouse, oblivious to everything around him, but I could no longer focus on anything else but what had happened just a few moments ago. Dinner seemed ordinary. Thomas, as usual, sat across from me, absorbed in his thoughts, checking lists, bookings, and itineraries. This dinner was supposed to be a moment for the two of us, a time to relax, to be together. After all, this trip across various cities was meant to refocus on our relationship, not hyperfixate on logistics. But instead, Thomas was lost in organizing every single day, as if this vacation was a project, not a chance for us to reconnect. "I think we should visit the national park tomorrow. There are some amazing trails, and I found out it's best to go in the morning before it gets too crowded," he said without even looking up from his phone. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Luis, sitting beside me, wasn't distracted by screens or obsessed with planning. His attention was here now. When he spoke, he looked me in the eyes, genuinely listening to what I had to say, asking about my feelings. It was surprisingly nice. He wasn't trying to organize every step of our day, but simply lived in the moment, as if everything that mattered was right in front of him. "How did you like the walk today, Aunt Anna?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. I looked at him and suddenly realized how much I was drawn to that ease with which he existed in the world. His looks lingered a little longer than casual conversation required. I noticed how his eyes stayed on me, waiting for my response as if my words meant something to him. "I really enjoyed it," I said, my voice softer than usual. Our gazes locked, and the moment stretched out longer than it should have. I felt a warmth spreading through me, an electric tension I hadn't known before. Thomas paid no attention to us, still engrossed in his endless plans, and I kept looking at Luis, wondering how far this could go. The thought both scared and excited me. To me, it still seemed like just a game, a small mischief, harmless flirtation. But something inside whispered that this could be more than just innocent interest. Luis had already made his way into my thoughts, and I wasn't sure I could stop myself if things went further. In the evening, Thomas, tired after the day, decided to stay home, while I felt the need to step outside. Luis offered to join me, and without hesitation, I agreed. My mind was still swirling with thoughts about the past few days, our walks, and the increasingly personal conversations. I just needed to distract myself, breathe in the sea air, and maybe for a while, forget about everything. We walked along the deserted beach, enjoying the quiet and the fresh breeze. I felt a sense of lightness and relaxation that only the ocean could bring. But suddenly our conversation shifted to playful teasing, and we, like children, started bantering with each other. Luis pretended to chase me, and laughing, I started running ahead. We ran along the beach, forgetting everything for a few moments. It felt like a game, like a return to childhood, carefree and joyful. I ran on the sand, the wind tousling my hair, and I laughed until I felt Luis catching up to me. Suddenly I tripped and fell into the sand, just like in the movies. And in the next moment, Luis, right behind me, fell on top of me. I quickly turned, ready to laugh and get up, but our eyes locked. The moment slowed, as if the world around us had stopped. The stars shone above, the only sound was the soft rush of waves, and between us the tension was undeniable. I saw his gaze grow serious. No words were spoken, but in that instant we both knew. This was a moment of weakness I had long anticipated and feared. Luis didn't hesitate. He kissed me passionately, and I couldn't and didn't want to resist. It was so unexpected, yet felt so natural. And I simply gave in to the feeling. On the deserted beach under the starry sky, our bodies came together in this one intimate moment. It happened so quickly, yet it felt as though this kiss had been inevitable from the start. For me, it was more than just a fleeting moment. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. When it was over, I lay on the sand, feeling emotions bubbling up inside me. Luis remained silent, but his eyes said everything. This was our first moment of intimacy, but I already knew there would be consequences, though I wasn't ready to face them yet. In the morning, Thomas suggested we take a walk around the city, just the two of us. I was surprised by his offer, considering how absorbed he had been in planning every detail of our trip lately, barely finding time for simple conversation. But I thought maybe this was a good sign, that he finally wanted to spend time with me alone. We walked outside, and for a while there was silence between us. Thomas seemed tense, as if he was preparing to discuss something important. I sensed it from the beginning, but tried to remain casual, not wanting to add any extra tension. "Anna, I've been thinking," he finally spoke, slowing his pace slightly. "Doesn't it feel to you like something's changed between us? We don't talk as much anymore, and we don't spend time together like we used to. I feel like we've grown distant." I didn't respond right away, trying to push down the growing unease inside me. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me, and I couldn't resist a sarcastic reply. "Oh, really? You've noticed we don't talk much anymore?" My tone was soft, but laced with meaning. "I thought you were too busy planning the perfect trip to notice. Maybe if you let things go with the flow sometimes and just enjoyed the moment, and us, you'd feel the difference." Thomas frowned, clearly not expecting such a response. He stopped, and I stood still too, looking into his eyes filled with confusion. "I just want everything to be perfect for us," he said, his voice weary. "I thought this would help us reconnect." I sighed, trying to keep calm. There was something sincere in his words, but it didn't take away the tension that had been building inside me with each passing day. No matter how much I tried to convince myself everything was fine, the guilt over the moments I'd shared with Luis was eating away at me. I couldn't just ignore the growing gap between me and Thomas, even though he was trying to make everything right in his own way. "Thomas, everything's fine," I said, forcing a smile though I was trembling inside. "Sometimes people just go through these phases. It's temporary." He nodded, but I could see from his expression that my words didn't ease his mind. Our conversation had only become more tense, and the walk felt slow and heavy. Every step weighed on me like a burden. We continued down the street, but I kept drifting into my thoughts, tormented by guilt. Every time Thomas spoke, I could hear the care in his voice. But it only made me feel worse for hiding the truth about what had happened between me and Luis. This walk, instead of bringing us closer, only deepened the crack that had already formed between us. I felt myself drifting further and further away, not only from Thomas, but from myself. My heart was torn between two worlds, the world of a marriage crumbling before my eyes, and a world of passion that I had created and could no longer control. The morning began with Thomas announcing our plan for the day, a tour of the beautiful caves. I nodded in agreement, though my thoughts were mixed about spending another day with both Thomas and Luis. I knew it would be another opportunity to be near Luis, but the excitement and guilt continued to swirl inside me. The caves were more magnificent than I had expected. Majestic stalactites hung from the ceilings, forming intricate shapes, and the echo of our footsteps reverberated underfoot. The guide was explaining the ancient drawings and the historical significance of the site, but I could hardly focus. I was all too aware of Luis's attention on me. As the tour reached one of the cave's forks, Luis moved closer and whispered, "Let's go the other way. There's something interesting over there." I knew this wasn't part of the tour, but his suggestion sent a rush of adrenaline through me. "You're crazy," I laughed quietly, but despite my protest, I followed him. Thomas was ahead with the group, fully absorbed in the guide's explanations. We veered off into a darker section of the cave. The air grew thicker, and the silence became almost palpable. We stopped in the darkest corner, and I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation from the world around us. "What are we doing here?" I asked with a nervous laugh, my heart racing in my chest. Instead of answering, Luis stepped closer, and in the next instant his lips met mine in a fierce, passionate kiss. It was sudden and almost wild. His hand slid under the hem of my dress, exploring my thighs, and I felt all my fears and doubts dissolve in that moment. Hidden in the darkness of the cave, away from prying eyes, we gave in to this forbidden passion. But time was against us, and hearing the distant sound of footsteps, we quickly pulled away. I straightened my dress, trying to catch my breath, and we hurried back to the main path. When we rejoined the group, Thomas was already waiting for us with a question. "Where were you?" he asked, slightly puzzled. "We found some beautiful cave drawings and stayed behind to take a closer look," Luis replied without missing a beat. Thomas frowned. "Why didn't you call for me?" I quickly chimed in. "We didn't want to interrupt, so we thought we'd catch up later." Thomas glanced between the two of us, but to my relief, he didn't suspect anything. We continued the tour, but inside I was boiling with emotions. My mind spun with thoughts of what had just happened and how easily we could have been caught. But that moment in the dark cave had been too irresistible to regret. Our time in California was coming to an end, and every day I found myself thinking that this closeness with Luis was just a temporary fling. I convinced myself that once we left, the guilt would fade, and I could leave it all behind, like a recent memory that would never trouble me again. But while we were still here, the passion between us only grew stronger. I found more and more reasons to be alone with Luis, even though we lived under the same roof. We spent more time together under various pretexts, helping around the house, taking walks when Thomas was busy. My behavior became increasingly secretive. I knew Thomas's schedule by heart and skillfully used it to ensure that Luis and I had time for each other. The more I hid behind these plans, the more confident I became that I could control the situation. Thomas was too engrossed in his projects and thoughts to notice anything unusual. I was certain I could continue living this double life without ruining everything around me. But in moments when I was alone with Thomas, waves of guilt would wash over me. He was so caring, so genuine. I couldn't help but feel like I was deceiving him every time he smiled and asked how my day had been. His attention and support only intensified my sense of guilt. I saw in him a man who deserved far more than I was giving him, and that feeling tore me apart. I hoped that once we left California, it would end, that I could leave all these feelings and memories behind, on the shore of the ocean, never to revisit them again. But deep down, I felt that things weren't as simple as I imagined. I had gone too far, and I realized I had fewer and fewer chances to turn back. The morning started with Thomas coming to me with another plan, a long excursion that was supposed to take several hours. His eyes sparkled with excitement, just as they always did when he planned new trips. But in my mind, I had already made a different decision. "Thomas, I think I should stay behind. I'm not feeling well," I said, trying to infuse my voice with the right amount of exhaustion and sincerity. I knew he wouldn't doubt me. Thomas always trusted me. "Oh, of course, I don't want you to overexert yourself. Rest up and I'll be back later," he said, his voice full of concern as he kissed my forehead. He left, leaving me alone in the apartment, though I knew I wouldn't be alone for long. Almost as soon as he was out the door, Luis appeared, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. We exchanged brief glances and everything was clear. Today was our day. Words were unnecessary. We quickly fell into each other's arms, our bodies merging in passion, and for a while I was able to forget everything. Guilt, Thomas, the fact that soon we would be leaving California. Luis was gentle. With every touch, my breath caught in my throat. His hands moved over me as if he wanted to savor every second, and I responded to his every movement, sinking into this moment as if it held our entire reality. His hands roamed over my body, his lips hungrily found mine, and it was all so shameless, so wrong, yet incredibly thrilling. Time seemed to stop. We spent just over an hour together, but that hour felt like only a few minutes. Time had lost its meaning. I was certain we still had plenty of time before Thomas returned to hide everything and continue playing our dangerous game. As we finally slowed down, our breathing returning to normal, I felt myself coming back to reality. A sense of danger bubbled up inside me, but instead of sobering me, it only heightened the desire to continue. We both knew that time was ticking, and soon everything might change. But for now, this was our secret space, and we could use it however we wanted. I was completely certain that we had hours before Thomas returned. He had gone on the excursion, and his long absence gave me a false sense of security. In my mind, I believed I was in control, that this secret would remain hidden. My confidence that Thomas would never find out about my betrayal dulled my senses. I stopped paying attention to the reality around me, fully immersed in the moments of passion with Luis. For me, it wasn't just a physical act. It was something more, a temporary escape from the everyday life, from a marriage that had long stopped fulfilling me. In Luis's arms, I felt alive, as though the weight of the world had vanished, leaving me with these intense, forbidden emotions. We laughed, whispered, and lost track of time. His gentle touches and warm kisses pulled me further away from reality. In this moment, there was no past or future, just here and now. I convinced myself that I could allow this, that I still had hours before Thomas would come home. This confidence made me careless. I didn't notice the sounds outside the room, didn't hear time slipping away faster than I realized. My mind was filled only with Luis, with his touch, and with how everything seemed so simple and clear in this moment. I was too deep in my illusion to think about what was happening around me. Time seemed to stand still as I lay in bed with Luis. His touch, his warmth, it had all consumed me so deeply that I lost all sense of reality. In my mind, I was certain we still had hours before Thomas would return. I wasn't worried about anything, completely absorbed in this forbidden world we had created. My confidence that Thomas would never find out felt unshakable. And then I heard footsteps. At first, I didn't pay attention. Everything seemed so distant, as if it were part of another world, far from the one Luis and I were in. But the footsteps grew closer. The next moment, the bedroom door flew open. I turned, and my heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was Thomas. His face reflected everything: shock, pain, anger. My entire world collapsed in that instant, and I realized that no words or excuses could save this moment. The time I had thought was infinite had run out. He stood there, his eyes filled with what I had feared the most: betrayal, the betrayal I had caused. "Anna!" His voice sliced through the silence, echoing in my head. I froze, unable to say a word. Everything Luis and I had done, all our hidden passion, suddenly felt like an empty illusion as reality crashed into me. Luis was frozen too, at a complete loss for words. We were both trapped in the web I had spun. In that moment, all my certainties, all the excuses and self-deception vanished. Standing in front of me was my husband, the man I had spent years with, the man I had betrayed in the worst possible way. His face was twisted in pain and fury, and I knew that what I had done could never be undone. The world I had worked so hard to keep hidden from everyone crumbled right before my eyes, and I could only watch it fall apart, knowing I was the one who had destroyed everything that mattered. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face twisted in pain that quickly morphed into fury. With each step he took further into the room, I could feel his anger growing, and the tension in the air became unbearable. I knew this was the moment I had dreaded the most, but now it was here, unavoidable. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was laced with barely contained rage. His eyes darted between me and Luis, trying to grasp how we could have gone this far. "Thomas, I started, but the words felt empty. Any justification, any attempt to explain myself was pointless. Nothing I said could change what I had done. He laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter, only bitterness and sarcasm. "So this is how you're sick, huh?" He spat with irony, and his words cut into me like a knife. My confidence evaporated, and I realized that no explanation would matter now. Thomas clenched his fists, his face contorted in an internal struggle. He was clearly trying to hold himself back to keep from lashing out at me and Luis. In the next instant, unable to contain his fury, he turned and started pounding his fists against the wall. Each hit landed with a dull, heavy thud, reverberating through the room like the echo of my betrayal. "Thomas, please stop!" I screamed, feeling panic take over. But he didn't listen, or maybe he just didn't want to hear me. His fists kept crashing into the wall over and over, and I stood there, helpless to stop him. Luis stood frozen like a statue, saying nothing. He didn't try to intervene, didn't make any move to stop Thomas. I saw the guilt and fear in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. We both stood there, paralyzed, unable to do anything to help or to change what was happening. Thomas kept hitting the wall, and I realized that each punch wasn't just about physical pain. It was his way of dealing with the fact that his world had just crumbled. Our lives would never be the same again, and I knew nothing could fix the damage I had caused. When the door closed behind Thomas, everything around me felt gray and lifeless. His words still echoed in my head. "I'm not going to discuss this. Neither of you deserve that." Thomas had left, hastily packing his things, unwilling to see us for even a moment longer. I watched him go, realizing that with his departure, I had lost not only my husband, but also the life we had built over the years. My affair with Luis had destroyed everything. I knew it was a risk. I knew that sooner or later the truth might come out. But I had hoped I could keep it under control, that no one would ever find out, and that this passion would be fleeting, leaving no trace on my real life. But I was wrong. This temporary infatuation, this passion that had seemed so alluring in the end had no real meaning. All I was left with was ruined relationships and a hollow emptiness. As I was left alone with Luis in the house, the atmosphere became oppressive. Everything that had been between us now seemed meaningless. We sat in silence, and I realized that I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't bear to be in this house, where every reminder of what had happened weighed heavily on me. I started packing my things. Time stretched endlessly. Every item I placed in my bag felt like another piece of what had been shattered. Luis tried to offer support, his voice gentle, but I could barely hear him. "Anna, we can figure this out," he began, but I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. "I need to be alone," I replied, trying to steady my voice, which trembled with exhaustion and pain. I couldn't keep having this conversation. Luis wanted to say something more, but he fell silent, realizing I had no energy or desire left to discuss anything. When my things were packed, I stopped at the door, turning to him. The goodbye hung heavily in the air, and it was more difficult than I had expected. "Goodbye, Luis," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but each word felt like a hammer blow to my heart. He looked at me, as if trying to respond, but then simply nodded. His face mirrored all the pain I felt inside. I knew this moment was final. There were no more plans or hopes for a future with him. All that remained was emptiness. I needed to leave, to put it all behind me. As I stepped out of the house, a wave of emptiness swept over me. I didn't know how I would live from here on. I didn't know what to do or where to go. The only thing I understood was that I needed to get away, to leave everything behind. But even as I walked away, I knew I couldn't escape the consequences of my choices. I left California with a heavy heart, leaving behind everything that tied me to the events that had unfolded. Every mile that took me farther from the place where everything had fallen apart felt like a step toward a new beginning. The city, the house, everything. I left it all in the past, a past that now dragged me down like a heavy weight. I knew I couldn't escape the consequences of my decisions, but now I desperately wanted to free myself from the pain. The car gently rocked on the road, and my thoughts drifted far away. It felt as though my entire life up until this point had been one big illusion, an illusion I had shattered with my own hands. Saying goodbye to Luis, the hurt on Thomas's face, all these images swirled in my head in an endless loop. I realized that this journey wasn't just a physical escape. It was a path toward something new, a chance to start over. I didn't know what awaited me. I didn't know what my new path would be, but I felt it was the only way forward. I needed to restore my identity, to find myself again, without the heavy memories that tied me to the past. I had to move on, but this time for myself, without the mistakes I had made. The first step was the hardest, letting go of everything I had known and loved, and accepting that this chapter of my life was over. But with each step it became easier. This journey, despite the loneliness, brought me hope that I could become myself again, that I could find peace within. I was no longer tied to the people I had betrayed, and that gave me freedom. I didn't know where this new path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever was coming. Life had given me a chance to start over, and I intended to make the most of it.